Welcome back to another Titans card review. Today we're taking a look at all of the priest cards, including this guy and what might be the start of a new archetype for priest, which is pretty cool. We've got Rodin here, the Titan Keeper. He's a 6-mana 5/5 with Death Rattle. Summon each other minion you've played this game that didn't start in your deck, which when you take a look at that, you're probably thinking about Thief Priest. You know, oh, I'm gonna copy a bunch of my opponent's stuff, generate all these extra cards, I'm gonna play those minions throughout the course of the game naturally, and then Rodin is going to give me, you know, this nice second wave of threats based on all these things I've generated and copied and so on. And yes, that's a possibility. Actually, that could be one payoff here for Rodin, but that's not all. We're going to take a look at a bunch of new cards in this video, which I'm going to wave my hands right now, so I'll remember to flash these up on screen during the editing process here shortly. We're going to look at these cards that also support Rodin here with a whole new kind of built-in game plan of cards that in various ways are going to give you extra copies and then, or help you get extra copies, and then also scale based on the number of copies as well, so that you have this like built-in plan where you're just playing all these various minions and scaling them up. Then we're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Opponents got to deal with those, and then you've also got Rodin in many cases to bring those back, and even gonna have aura effects that help them get big when they come back off the Rodin, which is really cool. Like, this sounds super fun. I like the idea here of like a Pogo Hopper Priest more than I can possibly explain, but I do have some concerns here, right? Because number one, like a lot of these sort of I'm making these things bigger, it takes a while to unfold. You got to spin all this up. It's taking many turns. It's taking a long time to get all these pieces moving. And while Priest definitely is a class that normally has survivability and can kind of do a lot of things, they have to often dedicate so many cards and so much of their deck to doing that. Like Control Priest is a whole deck built around doing that. Can they afford all these extra slots given up to this like Rodin package as a kind of win condition? What's the balance there between survivability and the greed of this Rodin package? That's going to be really tough from a deck building standpoint to achieve that survivability balance. But then also for Rodin himself, I'm a little nervous. He is on a Death Rattle here, so you kind of plop this down, and if you can't activate it yourself, which you can, but that's just even more work you got to put into it. If you just sit it there, the opponent can just ignore it, number one, just smack you in the face, be like, ah, whatever. Then maybe you trade it in the next turn, you get your big board, but it doesn't get to act immediately. These cards that we're seeing don't have taunt or rush or those sorts of things that give them immediate impact. The opponent just ignores it again, just hits you in the face or whatever, right? That's a big concern. Also just susceptible to silences, of course, if you're not activating it yourself. These Death Rattles can be a little bit tough to pull off in those cases, and it's kind of a one-time punch. You play your Rodin and that's it. You're like, hey, here's my board. Obviously Priest has ways to copy Rodin, which I think they will do. They'll have to probably get enough waves of this to feel like you've really won the game. But that said, again, that's just more work going into this, more cards going into this, which creates that imbalance issue from a deck building standpoint we talked about. So this is like an ultimate greed game plan, but it's not one that's as defensive as normal, which I think that's going to create problems for this. So this is like the most exciting and fun looking archetype I've seen in a long time. I cannot wait to play this, but I have some real concerns about its viability because it does just feel like a lot of work to get this moving, and the payoff is ultimately super fun, but not maybe even that like game winning directly or quickly. So that's a concern. So let's talk about some of the building blocks here. The Astral Automaton, a 1-mana 1/1 mech. It has +1/+1 for each other Astral Automaton you've summoned this game. So the first one's a 1/1, the second one is a 2/2, so on and so forth. And thankfully these are summoned, not played. So anything that brings these back to life, like Rodin's, each time they'll keep incrementing and getting bigger and bigger. So in normal circumstances, right, this isn't much. You're going to need to shuffle these in. You're going to need to have copies of these in order to make them big enough. They are just one cost, which is nice, but you know, getting these up to 4/4 or 5/5 range, where I think they start to become really interesting, is tough. It takes a lot of mana and a lot of work, which again contributes to the deck building challenge for this package. It's starting to feel more and more like meme, and less like, you know, a competitive way to play the game, because you're just spending so much work supporting this, getting it up to a competitive level. Because, you know, even as a 1-mana 3/3, like, yeah, okay, that makes sense on a you know, in a vacuum at a surface level, but it's happening so late in the game. It's happening on turn 5, turn 6, turn 7. The 1-mana 3/3 is not really going to be making much of an impact. It's just a stat sort of play at that stage, right? So you need to get these to where they're really threatening for them to make sense, and that just takes a lot of commitment and a lot of resources to do. So again, incredibly fun looking Pogo Hopper Priest sort of thing, but an incredibly slow and non-competitive looking thing as well, as far as I can tell. So next up here is Student of the Stars, a 3-mana 4/3. We're bringing back another death roll here like Raw did. This one's going to shuffle a copy of this into your deck with a permanent +3/+3. So then you've got a 7/6 for 3 mana, which is actually pretty cool. This feels a little faster to me because it's doing a lot of the work itself. You're not needing to support this with additional cards. It's not totally understated when you play it on 3. So this one kind of feels like it's just doing its thing, and you don't need to put in all these extra resources and all this extra time. I mean, the payoff is once you draw it, which can take a while to draw into the next one, but it's not so bad at a base level that you feel terrible to play it. So this is more interesting, but notably, like we talked about before, it still doesn't have things like Taunt or Rush. So even when you get the big one down, it's going to take a while for those stats to make an impact and actually interact with the game. Same thing with all this coming back off Raw Din. It's going to be more about like shuffling those extra ones in than actually making that immediate impact or immediate threat, I think. So I think it looks super, super fun. I just have a hard time seeing all of it come together. Although this piece does feel better to me than others. I don't actually think this is a card that can be run independently, though. It's still probably not good enough to like just toss into a deck as is. I think it probably needs to be a part of this package, which may indeed hold it back. So next up here, we've got the Shapeless Constellation, which is one of the craziest looking artworks we've ever seen in Hearthstone. That is awesome and trippy and cool. This is an 8-mana 8/8 with a Battlecry transform into an 8/8 copy of a random minion in your hand. Which I think, since this happens on Battlecry, I think Raw Din will count this. Raw Din is summon each other minion you've played this game that didn't start in your deck. I think the Battlecry will resolve and will count as been having played. I particularly think that because these cards were printed and revealed together, which seems to indicate they do harbor some sort of synergy together. So this might be another way to get a big version of a thing for Raw Din, or honestly just an extra Raw Din itself, which is kind of cool as well if you could hit your Raw Din there. Outside of that, this card looks pretty hard to use as an 8-mana play. Like anything you'd want to copy, you're not really cheating it out early necessarily. There are some big high value kind of minions, and if you did run a deck with very few minions, you might be able to do things, like get an extra copy of your Titan, for instance, that pays off. An extra Colossal sort of thing is definitely a possibility for something like this, which doesn't hurt. But again, Control Priest has a fine line to walk in regards to the number of expensive things they can run and the balance for a Control Priest deck. So I don't think this necessarily gets there in a Control Priest, even with really high priority targets being filtered down to. Still just increases the average cost of your hands and plays probably a little bit too much. As far as a Raw Din deck, I am assuming that this is synergistic, but it's coming on pretty late again as an 8-mana sort of play. And feels like you might have a lot of random stuff that doesn't necessarily feel that good to hit off the Shapeless Constellation. Like, yeah, okay, I hit an Automaton. That's a giant pile of stats. But again, it's just stats. No immediate impact. So moving on, we've got the False Disciple here. A 2-mana 2/2. Battlecry, discover a legendary priest minion from the past. And this is cool. This could certainly support a Raw Din kind of deck. No question. Getting minions here that did not start in your deck is pretty awesome and cool, but doesn't have to. This could also, I think, just be a reasonably good value generator for Priest. Of course, there are a bunch of old Priest legendaries. Some are good, some are not so good, but on average, I think you could find something that you appreciated a little bit. You know, get that cool Murazond. You know, get a Something, maybe not. I mean, on average, honestly, a lot of these old cards don't hold up all that well, so that does make me a tad nervous. Are you gonna get 1 in 3 good options on average? Man, I maybe we'll just say maybe. Some stuff's really cool, some stuff could be very, very powerful, but I think there's gonna be games you do get 3 things you're maybe not that interested in or excited about. So nonetheless, cheap value like this can go a long way for Priest. Just getting a body down, getting something generated. May trend a little bit more towards a Raw Den deck than anything else, but I wouldn't totally count this one out as a general use value generator otherwise in Priest. And then next up here we have Creation Protocol, a 2-mana Forge spell. This one's going to discover a copy of a minion in your deck. That being a copy, of course, means that does indeed play into Raw Den, and if you forge this at a time, you can get another copy of that card. So obviously, with things like your automaton, this is an additional way to start scaling up your automatons. And I do like how cheap they are in regards to syncing up with this card, because you know you're paying quite a bit of mana to do this. So having that cheap follow-up to get those stats and get that upside rolling faster does help a card like this get moving. Now that said, a card like this can still certainly exist outside of that. We've seen Shadow Visions type cards in Priest obviously work really, really well. And now with some great, you know, big stuff to hit for minions and Control Priest, I wouldn't be shocked at all if this slotted into Control Priest. Hitting something like the Titan Amanthul could be really amazing. Hitting the Colossal could be really amazing. Getting extra copies of those can go a long way because you don't have to run them in your deck to decrease consistency, but this allows you to turn mana into extra versions of those really high value cards and threats that still have a lot of reactivity and survivability built in as well. So ultimately, I think that makes Creation Protocol a pretty interesting card even outside of Raw Den decks. I think this is one we could certainly see played, and does have some good fits for Control Priest in particular, where I think a lot of classes have trouble maybe spending mana on Forge. I don't know that Priest necessarily does. I think they're quite happy to have ways to float in some extra mana that otherwise might get lost along the way. So next up here is the Stars Align, a new 3-mana spell for Priest. It got revealed a little earlier in the day and didn't make a ton of sense as is. Still feels a little weird for Priest, but after having seen Raw Den, certainly the context on this card coming together a little more. This one will transform minions in your hand into ones that cost 3 more, but they keep their original cost. So, you know, if you've got a handful of small-ish things, you can make them bigger and meatier from a stat standpoint, but still keeping their cost, allowing you to play some stuff out more quickly. And then you've got cards like Raw Den there as a backup plan to maybe resummon some of these things that you effectively cheated into play. And listen, the Stars Align is a really high power card, technically, because, you know, if you had even just 5 things in hand and you're bumping their costs up by 3, it's on average going to add about 3/3 to their stats, which means on average you're going to get about 15 in stats for a 3-mana card, which that's obviously insane. And it is nice that this is a hand transform instead of a board transform, so things like battle cries can still be used and interesting, and they need to be played to feed into the Raw Den. So all of that definitely seems to fit from a design standpoint. That said, though, of course, you know, still random cards are random, and you're gonna have like synergies that don't work, and like death rattles that don't really do things that are maybe useful for you care about, and the card quality is going to be low sometimes. So, you know, taking known fixed entities that you run in your deck and you like and then turning them into random stuff is a risk. Also, of course, if you already have Raw Den in hand, Stars Align gets really weird because it's going to transform your Raw Den. If this said something like transform minions that cost, you know, 5 or less, then you could maybe like protect your Raw Den. So even in a Raw Den deck, there's some inherent risk to this because you gotta like draw your Raw Den or shuffle it in or do something to get the Stars Align to actually feel good and work. But even if you don't, even if Raw Den's in the deck, still this takes a long time to maybe play all this out. You got a bunch of cheap cards you got to play out after this. It takes, again, a long time to spin all these pieces up, which makes me nervous because you're running a lot of stuff to support this package. And seems really slow. So can Control Priest find enough space for this, or can you find enough control cards to stay alive for this? All of those are questions that seem really, really challenging. There is, I think, maybe a different angle for this card too, which is Thief Priest stuff. If you just accrue a bunch of garbage over the course of a Thief Priest game, a little random minion here, a little random minion there that you don't have any use for, this could be a way to increase the quality of those. Turning these cards that you've sort of been left on here that don't do much, making them slightly better. Maybe just run like one of these as a release valve for that. Maybe just discover this, do that too, though. So that's a separate angle that's kind of interesting. I will say, ultimately, this card just has a lot of power. It can make big stats, and that is sometimes scary in its own right. I don't really see this coming together. I don't really see a line, but I always want to keep cards like this in mind because the numbers are just technically so big that sometimes they carve out space for themselves where you might not otherwise expect them to. So next up here we have Serenity, a 4-mana spell, holy, and give all enemy minions -2 attack, destroy any with 0 attack. So this is a cool card. It's a mix of like small board removal with, I would say, sort of a stall card, because of course, if you hit things with 2 or less attack, they're going to get wiped out and die. But if you hit things with 3 or more attack, you're basically just going to be negating their threat on board a little bit. So 3 attack minions pushed down to 1 attack, for instance, might not be as scary. And even if you leave behind 2 or 3, maybe you're not all that intimidated by a bunch of 1 attack minions. You think you can sort of out heal that pressure over the next few turns in a control priest deck. And Serenity has done its job, cleaning up a little bit of the mess, saving those 1/3s perhaps for the next round of Serenity, or just sort of stalling them out into that next big board clear you might have access to. So I think in a lot of ways it serves a cool purpose as a mid-game stopgap kind of removal in these sort of control decks, where you're not sad if everything doesn't die, and frankly a lot of things won't die a lot of the time because there's so many 3 attack units out there in the world. So in essence, I think this card serves a nice purpose, has a fairly reasonable power level. The only real question for cards like this one is just a matter of competition. It's basically got a lot of other really useful control tools to compete against in control priest decks. They're not lacking for things to do and cool cards to play very often that are control-y. So will this get there? It may be one of those things that depends on the meta and the shape of minions that are most commonly seen across a variety of different meta opponents. So maybe it's one that comes and goes. Maybe you just see one of these. Maybe it's near the bottom of the list as far as importance, but I think still absolutely a playable card with a completely reasonable and useful effect. So our final card here is Grace of the High Father, a 3-mana spell. It's a holy spell, restores 8 health, and it discovers you a card that costs the amount overhealed. So a little bit of an overheal payoff of sorts bundled into this card. You got the kind of healing touch, cost, and health restore, and then upside if you overheal. So that means you're going to discover a card basically that costs from 1 to 8 mana, because you can't overheal for 0. That wouldn't be overhealing. That would just be properly healing. Which, that's interesting. Now, note that you're discovering, from like the neutral pool here too, they got to fill in on these costs, of course. It's not discover a spell. It's not just class cards. So sometimes, if you discover 4 cost things, you might get offered 4 like neutral minions that are garbage. You're not going to always get things that are great, which I actually do think is a limitation. It's an important aspect of this card because you need that to fill in all the numbers. I'm sure without neutral, there'd be gaps in any given class's costs that you'd have trouble getting maybe 3 8-cost priest cards, for instance, but neutral can fix that. So I think consistency of the reward here is going to be pretty low. I also think it's just kind of weird, like when you're excited about the heal, when you really need to heal 8, you're probably not discovering at all because you're like desperate for health. And then when you're not desperate for health, the heal 8's less compelling, and the discover, then it's like, okay, I'm getting a thing, but is this really like the strongest turn? I'm spending a lot of mana on a heal, maybe I don't really care that much about. Obviously there are overheal synergies that you can proc with this as well, but it's not the most efficient healing in that case either. 3 mana in a deck that's running like tempo overheal stuff might feel like a pretty big commitment in that case. So I think there are some sweet spots with this. Maybe discovering a 1 or 2 cost card might feel better, but again, then you've got this neutral pool just kind of overwhelming the odds a little bit. It's like the odds of getting like a priest spell that you really want, even if you do filter down to 1 or 2 costs or something, still not actually all that likely. So at the end of the day, I think the inconsistency in the discover here, both in proccing it, because it's not always going to hit when you want, and in the result of it, are actually going to hold this card back quite a bit. It's one of those things that will be great when you discover it sometimes in a game and you're just needing some healing in a pinch, but I don't see this getting run in your deck all that often. So Serenity is a 4-star card. Stars Align is a 3-star card. Grace of the Highfather is a 2-star card. Ra Din is a 2-star card. Astral Automaton is a 2-star card. Student of the Stars is a 3-star card. Creation Protocol is a 4-star card. False Disciple is a 3-star card. Shapeless Constellation is a 2-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this review. Pretty crazy set of stuff here for Priest. I'm really excited to play this. I don't think it's going to be great, though. Curious if you think it has a chance to be good. Can this come together fast enough? Can it scale up big enough? I want to hear all those thoughts and more in the comments below. But until then, thanks so much for watching. And until next time, game on.